The silence in the new apartment was its own kind of violence. Stella stood in the doorway of the boys' room, gripping the frame so hard her knuckles ached, watching the slow rise and fall of their small chests. Ethan and Noah. She'd practiced the names for weeks before the move, rehearsing them in the mirror like an actress learning lines for a role she could never afford to forget. Ethan. Noah. Bennett. Not Miller. Never Miller again. But names were just sounds. She moved closer, lowering herself to the edge of Ethan's bed, and the moonlight caught his face at exactly the wrong angle, the sharp set of his jaw, the dark, serious eyes even in sleep, even at 6 years old. And her breath left her body like something had reached inside and taken it. George. She pressed her fist to her mouth. She had told herself the hardest part was leaving. Then she told herself the hardest part was the safe house. Then the hearing. Then the relocation. She had moved the finish line so many times that she'd stopped believing there was one. Because the hardest part, she understood it now, crouched in the dark above her sleeping son, was this. Not the running. The watching. The forever watching. The understanding that she had changed their names, changed their city, changed their school and their doctors and the color of her own hair, and she could not change a single molecule of the blood moving quietly through their veins. George's blood. In her son's. A tear fell onto Ethan's pillow before she realized she was crying. She didn't sob, she'd trained herself out of that long ago. These were the silent tears of someone who had learned that grief, like everything else dangerous, had to be concealed. She stood, checking Noah next, tucking the blanket, and then she froze. Noah's window. She had locked it. She always locked it. It was open exactly 1 inch. Not from the wind. The night was perfectly still. She spun toward the hallway, her heart detonating in her chest, scanning the dark apartment, and that's when she heard it. A single, deliberate footstep from somewhere inside the apartment. They had already found her. If you're watching part 3, thank you for being here. But to fully understand the story, the choices, the emotions, and the shocking moments, you need to watch part 1 and 2 also. That's where everything truly began. After this, go back and watch part 1 and 2. And if you enjoyed the story, please like this video and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Now, Nathaniel delivered the news the way doctors deliver terminal diagnoses, carefully, watching her face for the moment it broke. It didn't break. Stella had stopped breaking in rooms where other people could see. He's asking for the boys, Nathaniel said. His attorneys are calling it a humanitarian request. He is maybe 6 weeks. 6 weeks. She turned to the window so Nathaniel couldn't see what moved across her face, something that wasn't grief and wasn't relief and was somehow both. George Miller was dying in a federal prison, and he wanted to see his sons. She thought about Ethan's jaw in the moonlight. Noah's laugh, the one that came from somewhere so innocent it physically hurt to hear. She had smuggled those boys out of a life that would have consumed them, and now that life was sending an engraved invitation to come back, dressed in the language of mercy, of last wishes, of don't let them regret this. She went alone. The drive took 3 hours. She spent every mile rehearsing detachment like a religion. He was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing. George Miller, who had once filled every room he entered with the specific gravity of a man who owned whatever he stood on, he sat behind the glass looking like something important had been removed from inside him. The armor, she realized. Someone had finally stripped it off. He picked up the phone. She made herself do the same. Stella. Her name in his mouth still landed like a hand around her throat. They're not coming, George. His jaw tightened. There it was, Ethan's jaw, in this ruined face, and she hated him freshly for it. They're my sons. They were. Her voice was granite. They don't remember you. And I will spend every remaining year of my life making sure it stays that way. She watched it land. Watched the precise moment George Miller understood that prison hadn't been her revenge. This was His sons were alive and safe and completely, irrevocably his, and they called another man's surname and would cry at another man's funeral. She stood to leave. Stella. His voice cracked open. There's something you don't know. About why I really sent them after you. Her hand stopped on the receiver. She found Carla Reyes in a studio apartment above a laundromat in Trenton, which told Stella everything about what the Salcedos paid their informants after they'd been used up. She didn't knock. She'd learned how to open cheap locks in the safe house from a woman who'd learned it in worse places. Carla was at the kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, and when she looked up, her face did something Stella hadn't expected. It didn't run. It simply collapsed. I wondered when you'd come, Carla whispered. Stella had rehearsed this too. She'd carried the confrontation for months like a stone in her chest, had imagined it 100 ways, her hands, her voice, the precise words she would use to dismantle this woman the way this woman had dismantled her life. She'd sold the names. Ethan and Noah Bennett sold them like they were account numbers, like her boys were line items in someone else's ledger. Why? Not a question. A blade laid flat on the table between them. Carla's eyes filled. They had my daughter. The stone in Stella's chest shifted. They took her for 3 days. Carla's voice was barely a threat. They said if I gave them the names, she'd come home. They said if I didn't, she stopped. Set down the mug before her shaking hands could drop it. She came home. She doesn't know. She can never know. Stella stood very still, feeling the specific agony of a narrative that refused to be simple. She had come here for a monster and found a mirror. A mother. Cornered. Choosing her child the only way the Salcedos allowed, badly, and at someone else's expense. Stella knew that architecture intimately. She'd lived inside it. They'll use you again, Stella said quietly. I know. And next time, whoever you give them won't survive it. Carla closed her eyes. A tear escaped. I know that too. Stella reached into her jacket. Set a phone and a folded paper on the table, Nathaniel's secondary contact, a name she'd protected like oxygen. One call. They'll move you and your daughter tonight. But you have to decide right now. Carla stared at it. Then Stella's own phone vibrated in her pocket. A message from Nathaniel. For words that turned her blood to ice. George Miller is dead. The call came at 4 a.m., which was when the worst things always came. Eleanor had been declining for weeks, but declining on her own imperious schedule, refusing to surrender to anything, including her own body, without making it an act of will. Even now, propped against white hospital pillows, she looked less like a dying woman and more like a queen who had simply chosen a dramatic venue. Stella sat beside the bed and said nothing. She'd learned that Eleanor found comfort not in words, but in presence, the specific weight of someone who refused to flinch. Give me your hand. Eleanor's voice was tissue paper over iron. Stella looked at that hand before she took it. The rings were gone, removed by nurses, she supposed, and without them it was just an old woman's hand, small and mapped with veins. She thought about what Nathaniel had once told her quietly, almost as a warning. That hand buried 3 rivals, 2 marriages, and 1 son who disappointed her. She took it anyway. I was never kind to George. Eleanor's eyes stayed on the ceiling. People thought I was grooming him. I was punishing him. For being born looking exactly like his father. A breath that cost her something. Every time I looked at him I saw every compromise I ever made. Every filthy thing I sanctioned. Her fingers tightened on Stella's. You cannot love a mirror, Stella. You can only smash it or look away. Eleanor. I'm not finished. Still commanding rooms, even horizontal. I love you because you're the thing this family never once managed to produce in 4 generations. Her eyes moved to Stella's face, and what was in them was so unguarded it was almost unbearable. Mercy. You had every reason to become us. You refused. Stella felt her throat close entirely. The Empire doesn't disappear when I do, Eleanor whispered. It simply looks for new hands. I don't want it. I know. Almost a smile. That's precisely why it will find you. Her breathing changed then. Everyone in those rooms always knew when breathing changed, and 4 minutes later, Eleanor Harmon was gone. Stella sat in the silence holding a dead woman's hand, feeling something vast and terrible settle across her shoulders like a mantle. Her phone lit up. An unknown number. A text containing only coordinates. And her son's school address. She drove to the school with her hands so tight on the wheel the leather creased. The coordinates had been a test. Nathaniel confirmed it within the hour. A Salcedo provocation designed to measure her response time, her panic, the shape of her fear. They hadn't touched the boys. They'd simply wanted her to know they could. It was working. Ethan was quiet on the ride home, which meant he was thinking, which meant he was his father's son in the one way Stella couldn't legislate away. He waited until she'd locked the apartment door, until Noah had wandered off to the bedroom, before he turned his dark, serious eyes up to her face. "Mama, are the bad men coming back?" The question detonated softly in the center of her chest. She had always answered this with no clean, immediate, a door slammed shut. But he was 7 now, and he had his father's jaw and his father's eyes and, God help her, his father's instinct for when a room was lying to him. No wouldn't hold anymore. She sat on the floor, not the couch, the floor, his level, and she took both his hands in hers and she told him a story. There was a knight, she said, who loved a forest more than she loved herself. For years she guarded it with kindness, with strategy, with every gentle tool a good knight carried. But the wolves that hunted the forest didn't fear kindness. They understood only one language. So the knight made a terrible choice. She let the dragon that lived inside her, the one she'd caged her whole life, she let it out. Just enough. Just to stand at the treeline with smoke rising from her throat so the wolves could see. She didn't become a monster, Stella told him quietly. She just let the monsters believe she had. Ethan listened with absolute gravity. Then, is the knight sad? Stella's smile didn't reach her eyes, but she built it carefully, brick by brick. The knight has the forest. That's enough. He seemed to accept this with the terrifying trust of a child who doesn't yet know what acceptance costs. She tucked him in an hour later and stood in the hallway and called Nathaniel. "Tell me everything we have on the Salcedos," she said. "Every name, every account, every weakness." Her voice didn't shake once. The dragon was out. She waited until the boys were asleep and the city had gone quiet enough that her footsteps on the pavement felt like confessions. The drive was in her coat pocket. She'd carried it for 18 months, like a second heartbeat. Every wire transfer, every name, every burial site the Harmon Empire had generated across 2 decades of careful, elegant brutality. She had documented it the way a surgeon documents a tumor, precisely, without flinching, knowing that the record itself was the only weapon that couldn't be taken from her. Now it was the weapon that could get her sons killed. The bridge looked smaller than memory had built it. That happened with places that held too much meaning. Reality could never compete with the architecture of grief. She was 24 the first time she'd stood here, and George had been beside her pointing at the skyline with that smile she'd spent years unlearning, telling her the city was theirs if she wanted it. She'd wanted it. God, she had wanted it. She stood at the railing and held the drive over the water and made herself feel the full weight of what she was releasing, not just the evidence, but the woman who'd gathered it. The Stella who had believed documentation was protection. Who thought the truth, carefully preserved, could save her. That woman was an earlier draft, written before she understood that safety wasn't built from records. It was built from fire. She opened her hand. The drive disappeared into the dark water without ceremony, without sound, almost, swallowed so completely it might never have existed. She watched the surface settle and thought about baptisms, the theology of submersion, the idea that you could drown oneself and surface as another. She gripped the railing and breathed the cold air and let herself mourn it. The evidence. The years. The Stella who still believed the system would intervene if she just gave it enough truth. Goodbye. She turned from the railing. A man was standing at the end of the bridge. He'd been there long enough that he wasn't trying to hide it. He was simply watching her with his hands in his pockets, backlit by a street lamp, his face obscured, but his posture communicated something that clenched every muscle in her body simultaneously. He knew exactly what she'd just thrown away. And he was smiling. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. More intense, unforgettable stories are coming, and you don't want to miss the next one. The Salcedos had finally learned that bullets created martyrs. So they sent lawyers instead. The filing arrived on a Tuesday, a cascading legal challenge to Eleanor's estate, designed not to win but to excavate. Discovery alone would surface the Bennett name, the relocation, the boys' new identities. It was elegant in its cruelty, not an attack. An unraveling. Stella read it twice, set it down, and called Nathaniel. "Get me the best courtroom attorney on the Eastern Seaboard," she said. "And find out who's funding the Salcedo legal team." "Stella." "Tonight, Nathaniel." She walked into the courtroom 8 days later wearing Eleanor's pearls, a decision she'd made deliberately, privately, like a soldier pinning a dead general's medals to her chest before a final campaign. The Salcedo attorneys were 3 men who carried themselves with the specific confidence of people who had never lost. They looked at her and saw a widow. A mother. A soft target wrapped in good fabric. She let them look. What followed was 4 hours of the most precise legal demolition she had ever witnessed, because she had spent 6 nights preparing every answer, every document, every counterfiling herself. Her attorney was excellent. But the architecture of the case was hers, built from the same methodical fury she'd once used to document the Harmon Empire's sins. The judge ruled before lunch. Standing on the courthouse steps afterward, the victory sat in her chest like a stone, cold, heavy, the wrong shape for celebration. She had won. The Bennett name held. The inheritance was sealed. The Salcedos had been publicly, legally dismantled in a venue they'd chosen themselves. She felt almost nothing. Then she heard Ethan laugh. She looked down to where the boys had found the courthouse fountain, Noah already soaked to the elbows, Ethan standing at the edge deciding whether to commit, and something cracked open in her chest so cleanly it nearly brought her to her knees. They were so beautiful. So unconscionably innocent. They had no idea what the last 4 hours had cost, what the last 4 years had cost, what she had burned and drowned and buried and become to keep them laughing at fountains. Her phone buzzed. Nathaniel. 3 words. The man's alive. The bridge. The smiling man. He hadn't been Salcedo. He'd been something far worse. 10 years changes the architecture of a life. The porch was hers, genuinely, legally, beautifully hers, on 2 acres outside of Asheville where the tree line turned amber in October, and the nearest neighbor was close enough for safety and far enough for silence. She had bought it under a name that was finally, after everything, simply her own. Ethan was 23 now. He taught middle school mathematics in Charleston and called every Sunday without being asked. Noah was in his 2nd year of medical school in Boston, and he laughed, God, he laughed, with a freedom so complete it sometimes stopped her mid-breath to witness it. Neither of them had their father's coldness. Neither carried the Harmon gravity, that particular heaviness of men who believed the world owed them its surrender. She had burned that inheritance down to the soil and salted the earth. She reached into her cardigan pocket and unfolded Eleanor's letter, the original, still creased from the day it arrived, the paper gone soft with handling. She had read it so many times the words had become something closer to memory than text. Eleanor's handwriting, imperious even in decline. You are the mercy this family never produced. Stella turned it over. Smoothed the blank side against her knee. She wrote slowly, the way she did everything now, without urgency, without the constant peripheral surveillance that had governed 15 years of her life. The man on the bridge had been dealt with. The Salcedos were a dismantled footnote. The empire had been quietly, methodically unwound by a woman they had catastrophically underestimated. It was over. She wrote to her sons about the knight and the dragon, and she wrote about Eleanor's hand in hers, and she wrote about a bridge at midnight and a drive swallowed by dark water. And she wrote about standing in courthouse doorways wearing borrowed pearls with a heart like granite and a mother's terror living just beneath the stone. She ended it the only way it could end. I became the storm so you could only ever know the sun. She folded the letter and held it in both hands and looked out at the amber tree lean, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, she exhaled completely. The gate at the bottom of the drive clicked open. Both boys, home early, walking up the path together, and behind them, a woman Stella had never seen, watching the house with careful, patient eyes. The storm, it seemed, had one final season left. The woman at the gate had her mother's eyes. Stella was on her feet before the thought fully formed, every old instinct firing, hands ready, heart hammering the familiar war drum rhythm. But Ethan turned back and saw her face and held up both palms, the way she'd taught him to signal safety when he was 7 years old and the world was full of shadows. Mama. His voice was so gentle it disarmed her completely. It's okay. We wanted to tell you ourselves. The woman's name was Lucia. She was a teacher too, history, which Stella found privately, painfully poetic. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's composure, and absolutely none of the harm and gravity. She shook Stella's hand on the porch and said, "I've heard so much about you," and Stella looked at Ethan and understood that he had told her not everything, but enough. Enough that this woman had come anyway. Mercy, Stella thought. He learned mercy. Noah pulled her aside while Ethan showed Lucia the tree line. He took both her hands the way she'd taken Eleanor's a decade ago, and his eyes were bright and terrifyingly earnest. "We know more than you think we do," he said quietly. "We've always known you carried something enormous. We needed you to know that it didn't break us, Mom. You didn't break us." She lasted approximately 4 seconds before she stopped being granite. She wept the way she hadn't wept in 10 years, not the silent, disciplined tears of a woman in survival, but the full, ungoverned grief of someone finally setting something down. Noah held on. Didn't speak. Just held on the way she had held him through every nightmare of his childhood, returned now with compound interest. Later, the 4 of them sat on the porch as the sun dissolved into the amber tree lean, and someone laughed at something small and ordinary, and then they were all laughing, and Stella sat in the middle of it feeling the specific, impossible warmth of a life that had survived itself. She thought about the letter, folded in her cardigan. "I became the storm so you could only ever know the sun." She looked at her son's kind, whole, luminous, and understood, finally, that the storm had always known what it was building. This. Exactly, and only this.